Don't hang up. I'm coming for you." I heard those words like a verdict, a thunderclap that turned the air in my tiny kitchen into something electric and dangerous. My hands went numb on the phone. I didn't know whether to laugh, cry, or drop to my knees. I could hear cars far below, the city that never slept moving without me, and the kettle whistling like it had something to tell me, too. For a moment, I thought it was some kind of sick joke, one of those viral prank calls that people forwarded like fireworks. Then a silence stretched on the other end, heavy and expectant, and I understood that this wasn't a prank and that my mistake, the wrong number I'd answered for a voice I'd never met, had just broken through the thin glass between my life and a world I had no business entering. My name, when he finally said it, was a private thing coming out like a public announcement. "Claire," he said, each syllable deliberate. The name felt small and absurd, like the label on a jar in a cupboard. He didn't offer an explanation, and I couldn't find my voice. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears, loud and traitorous. I had been so tired that morning I hadn't noticed the phone's unfamiliar ringtone, hadn't checked the number, and when the voice had said, "I'm at the edge. Do you have the package?" I had assumed wrong text, wrong person, the same ordinary mistake that had led to 100 awkward apologies in my life. I was Claire, 26, nursing assistant, living in a one-bedroom above a laundromat, counting my hours and my pennies. The only packages I handled were over-the-counter medications and linen carts. But the voice on the line had not accepted any of that. His presence filled the small kitchen like a shadow, folding the room inward. He asked nothing for a beat, and then he said, "Don't move." I was not a person who panicked easily. Caring for others had taught me a certain steady competence. You check the airway, you take a pulse, you tie the tourniquet before you think of the panic. But the man on the line made panic modern and surgical. Every cell in me instinctively followed his order. I sat. I did not hang up. Outside, rain had begun, thin at first and then harder, drumming on the fire escape and the cracked window pane like a metronome counting down. I stared at the phone and at the chipped linoleum that had seen better years, and I listened to him breathe as if I could gather information from its cadence. He sounded too composed to be a pseudo-gangster. He sounded like someone who had never needed to fake control in his life. He spoke in short sentences, in statements that left no room for negotiation. "Where are you?" he asked. I wanted to tell him the truth, that I lived above a laundromat, that I had duct-taped a broken lampshade, that I had a bruise on my knee from falling asleep on a folding chair the night before. But every detail felt like a strip of paper that, if torn, would release a danger I couldn't see. So I lied, because it felt safer, and I told him my street. He considered the name for a moment, an invisible map assembling in the space between us. Then he said, "Stay where you are. Lock the door. Don't let anyone in." He didn't ask. He commanded as if I were an object to be positioned, and yet the protection implied in the command made my throat tight. I remember telling him, after a minute that felt like an hour, that I didn't know who he was. He answered as if that were irrelevant. "It doesn't matter who I am. What matters is that whoever's looking for you will stop if they think you're not here. Stay." His voice softened with a strange, hard tenderness. "Claire, I will come get you." There was no promise in the way I'd heard promises in movies. This was less soft romance and more precise protocol. But the edges of something dangerous and possibly tender glimmered behind that precision like sunlight on gunmetal. The kettle screamed, and I let it hiss off, too distracted to pour. I pressed the phone to my ear and listened to the rain fill the silence between his words. I had never felt such a collision of fear and relief. The phone line had been a wrong number that should have ended with an apology and a shrug. Instead, it had become an opening, a jagged door that I did not know whether to run through or slam closed. He said, I'm not giving you a choice, Claire. And despite myself, despite every careful plan that had kept me alive through lonely nights and hospital shifts, I believed him. If you're watching, subscribe to our channel and tell us where you're watching from and what time it is right now. Then back to the story. The rain turned the city into a blurred watercolor. I checked the locks like an addict counting calories. The deadbolt resisted, then gave with a stubborn, satisfying click. I moved like someone under surveillance, quiet, efficient, conscious of every step. My apartment was small, a rectangle of things that were useful in secondhand. A wobbly table, a lamp with a torn shade, a mug with a chip, a mattress that sighed more than I did. On the counter, beside a pile of unpaid bills, was the thing that had started it all. An envelope with the hospital's name on it, a pale notice I'd been too frightened to open. Inside was a letter informing me of a furlough, a sudden budget cut that meant fewer shifts and less money. The timing had been cruel. Rent was due, and the pills for my mother's heart had run low. I've been looking for anything to make ends meet. I had been thinking about a second job, a morning shift in a diner, anything to buy time. I've been thinking of leaving, of taking the bus to anywhere with lower rents and higher hope. Instead, with one wrong call and one voice that did not belong to my world, I had a man who said, in language that brooked no rebuttal, that he would take care of me. I want to be petty. I wanted to ask him why. But terror keeps questions short. I folded my fingers around the phone, so hard the case left an imprint in my skin. "Who are you?" I whispered, but the whisper didn't feel as if it belonged to me anymore. He said, "Someone who doesn't leave women like you to fend for themselves." The declaration sounded like a statement of value and a stake in a chess game I didn't know I was playing. He told me to sit by the window, to pull the curtains slightly, so there was light but not vulnerability, and to keep the radio on low because noise makes people think there's company. I felt ridiculous obeying orders from a stranger, and yet I obeyed because the part of me that had learned to save lives had no tolerance for chaos. Some of my training had been about structure, triage, clear lines, protocols. There was an ugly comfort in the man on the line imposing structure on a day that had dissolved into bills and tears. Time became an elastic thing stretched between his voice and the footfalls he promised would come. I told myself that when he arrived, I would demand answers. I would find out if this was a setup, a trap designed to force me into something worse. I picture myself throwing the phone against the wall and picking up a knife just in case. But I didn't. I sat, counting the seconds like beads. The light shifted as the clouds moved, and the rain turned into a steady insistence. I kept the phone in my hand, because to let it go felt like abandoning a lifeline. Then, suddenly, there were heavy footsteps on the fire escape. At first, I thought it was my imagination. Then a shadow passed my window, careful and sure, and a gloved hand rapped once against the glass. My throat closed. I unlocked the door and opened it a hair. There he was, taller than I expected, the dark suit hanging on him like armor. He looked like he belonged in a room with mahogany and a fireplace, not on my chipped threshold. His hair was black and cut short at the temple. His eyes were a kind of hard brown that practiced an economy of expression. He smelled faintly of rain and something else, some expensive scent that made my scalp tighten. For a moment, we simply measured each other. He took me in as if noting the state of my apartment, the bruise on my knee, the thinness in my face. "You look better than the numbers sounded," he said, not a compliment exactly, more an observation. He was relentless and composed, like someone who'd rehearsed dread so often it had become a background noise. In that tight moment, his presence pressed on me both as a threat and a shield. He didn't introduce himself again. He didn't need to. There was a staff that came with him in a way, a presence, felt rather than seen. A car idling downstairs, the distant shuffle of men who weren't in the room, but who had assembled like shadows outside the edges of my life. He reached into his coat and produced a thick envelope, not unlike the one on my counter. "We heard you were in trouble," he said simply. I wanted to ask how we had heard anything about me, about a furlough and unpaid prescriptions and a life that had no importance beyond the hospital corridors where I moved like a ghost. But the man didn't wait for questions. He extended the envelope like something sacred and dangerous. When I opened it, there were banknotes stacked with a kind of precision that made my fingers tremble. They were more than enough for my rent, my mother's medicine, and a few months of breathing space. My first response was relief, so raw it left me dizzy. My second was suspicion. "Why?" I asked, because in that moment, with rain on my hair and money in my hands, the world had slipped on its axis. He looked at me, and for the first time a shadow crossed his face, not cruelty, not softness, but something like recognition. "Because you answered the wrong number," he said, "and because you didn't hang up when you could have." He smiled the barest fraction, and I felt it as a private thing he didn't share often. "Because you stayed." Whatever gamesmen in Hollywood had taught me about mafiosos and dangerous men did not prepare me for the sheen of hope that mixed with fear in that room. The offer, wrapped in delicacy and menace, felt like something both cruel and merciful. I wanted to throw the money back at him, to tell him I could get by, to show him the scraps I called dignity. But my mother needed her pills. The bills needed their stamps. And there was an undeniable cord connecting the voice on my phone, the man on my doorstep, and the sudden possibility of safety. He told me to pack a bag. He said we were leaving now. The word now was a lock. No debate, no slow negotiation. I had never moved so quickly in my life. He watched me with the patient, almost clinical attention of a man who measured time differently. I folded a few shirts into a duffel as if following a script. I slid my mother's medicine into a small zippered case and put a photograph of us into my wallet. I hadn't been able to remember anything about the photograph until then, and when I finally saw her lines and the way she smiled, the realness of what I was risking and what I'd be saving punched through my chest. He didn't speak as I hurried, only stood in the doorway, an immovable silhouette against the dull light outside. When I hesitated at the front door, he said, "You will come with me. I will not leave you to the cold." It was not a question. It was an ultimatum wrapped in protection. I could have run then, back into my narrow life of shifts and small, honest tasks. I could have closed my door on the envelope, on his statement, on the very idea that a wrong number could be a lifeline. But I'd been claustrophobic before the world had put its thumb on my throat. The air upstairs felt stifling in a different way. He offered space, gilded, dangerous space, but space nonetheless. I slid past him and into the car waiting outside, the rain kissing my cheeks as if to erase the past. Inside, the leather was cool and clean, the interior smelling like cedar and safety. He sat in the driver's seat and, for the first time, said his name. "I'm Dominic Rossi," he said, each syllable dry and heavy as lead. The name landed differently than anything else he'd said. Dominic. Rossi. Together, they were a punctuation mark. I had heard rumors in the hospital corridor about a name like that, the kind of whisper that makes nurses look over their shoulders and men with clean suits straighten up. There were stories of a man who ran things with a type of quiet brutality, who kept his world organized the way others kept a garden tidy, efficiently, precisely, without wasted mercy. I pictured marble floors, rooms that smelled faintly of money, men with faces like flint. My pulse stuttered. "Why me?" I asked him, like a child who refuses a spoonful of very bitter medicine. He regarded me with something like amusement. "Because you stayed on the line," he said. "Because you didn't hang up when most people would have." His answer was simple and infuriatingly true. In the car, the city blurred past in streaks of neon and wet asphalt. Dominic's hand rested casually on the wheel, one knuckle tapping. He seemed to measure everything. The way I breathed, the clench of my jaw, the way my fingers toyed with the duffel strap. For a stretch of the drive, he said nothing, and the silence became a room of its own. I kept glancing at him, at the man who had arrived to pluck me from my apartment like a character in a book who had been waiting for a protagonist to make a wrong sentence. When he finally spoke, his voice was quieter, the edges softened by the rumble of the road. "You're going to be safe with me, Claire," he said. "But safety has rules." The sentence was a hinge. He went on to list them with the same unsentimental efficiency he'd used with the locks and the envelope. There would be curfews. There would be no visitors unless he approved them. There would be trust that needed to be earned on both sides. I was not invited but informed. I felt both caged and relieved. The duality of it made something inside me tense and something else unexpectedly relax. "Do you understand?" he asked. I nodded, which meant I agreed or that I surrendered or both. I couldn't disentangle the two yet. The car wound its way out of the city proper and into neighborhoods that shifted from rented stoops to private gates. As we drove, Dominic's hands never left the wheel. When he looked at me, there was always that cool appraisal, like someone checking the alignment of a machine. He wasn't unkind. He simply reserved his mercy as one reserves a resource in a war. For my part, I try to make myself smaller, as if I could squeeze into some corner and be less complicated than I felt. The house he took me to wasn't the sort of place I could have imagined from the rumors. It wasn't showy in a tasteless way. It was enormous and tasteful and dangerous in the quietest sense. Marble floors that swallowed sound, windows that looked like paintings, rooms that waited politely for their occupants to make noise. The staff met us at the base of a sweeping staircase, brief nods and restrained smiles that said they knew more than they would tell. One of them, Elena, the housekeeper, gave me a look that was nothing like pity. Instead, it was something like appraisal, the way seasoned nurses check a patient and know what will heal and what won't. She showed me to a room that felt like a hotel suite, but with fewer frills and more order. A walk-in closet with space enough for my scattered life. A bathroom whose tiles gleamed like ice. A bed that swallowed me with pillows. Dominic left me there with a promise of protection and a list of rules. He said he would personally see to my mother's medication and to the bills. He said if anyone came looking for me, they'd find a private storm prepared to meet them. And then he left the door ajar as if to tell me, wordlessly, that I could not stay forever. That first night, I lay on the bed and watched the shadow of the rain on the window, and I thought about how a single wrong number had rewritten the map of my life. I had been clinging to small things, shifts, a grocery list, a plan to stretch a paycheck. Now I had marble and a man whose name tasted like danger on my tongue. It was dizzying. It was terrifying. It was, in some strange, inexplicable way, a relief. I slept for the first time in weeks without that gnawing terror at the base of my skull. They told me later that Dominic had a code. It seemed to run like a current through the house and the people who worked there. If loyalty was currency, then his household was wealthy beyond reckoning. There were men who moved like ghosts, shadows who handled the day-to-day violence and kept secrets like treasures. They opened doors without needing permission. They watched my small world with the same solemn intensity with which a surgeon reads an EKG. The staff were protective and efficient, and I met them one by one. Marco, the man who kept the cars running and who had the look of someone who'd never been surprised. Elena, who treated me like a wounded bird that might either fly or die, depending on what I chose. And Julian, a broad-shouldered guard with a smirk that never made it to his eyes. Each of them had a word for Dominic: boss, sire, leader, and each of them moved like they believed what he decreed mattered. In this house, privacy meant a different kind of ownership. Doors that closed with a soundless click, security that felt like a second skin. I watched the crew work with a mix of awe and the same prickly alienation that comes from realizing you're living in someone else's ecosystem. Dominic was present in the small things. He moved through the mansion like he owned not just the place, but the gravity of it. People parted as he walked. He interrupted a dinner for a misplaced dish, and no one questioned him. He seated me beside him at a dining table 2 nights after I arrived, and the hush that followed his arrival was like the lowering of a curtain. He asked me one question that evening. Do you regret answering? It took me a moment to understand what he meant. Answering what? Exactly. The call, the wrong number, the string of events that had led me to sit across from a man who could buy country and chose instead to buy my silence. I thought of my mother's crooked smile, of the small incense of hospital disinfectant that clung to my clothes, of the nights I'd close my eyes on a mattress and calculated whether I could live on less. Sometimes I admitted, and the honesty between us was a thing he seemed to like, maybe because it required nothing clever. He nodded once, simply, and the gesture was enough. In the weeks that followed, a new pattern formed. Dominic began to solve the problems I had been handling like a slow-burning fire. Rent caught up. Medical bills were quietly paid. Men from my past, an old boyfriend who'd been trying to squeeze money from me, and a loan shark who knew my address, were handled in ways I wouldn't have thought possible. Sometimes he did it with an envelope and a stern note. Other times it required the kind of decisive action that left me with a nauseous lump in my throat and a triumphant relief that warred with disgust. With each problem he erased, I watched not a villain, but a man who moved with a clarity of purpose. He possessed a brutal code, yes, but it was a code that protected. It was also impossible to ignore the way he watched me while he arranged my safety, his eyes like a measuring device gauging what part of me was fragile and what part could be sharpened. His protection came wrapped in ownership. He used words like mine with a casual cruelty that felt almost tender. The first time he said, "You're mine," I wanted to retaliate with disdain. I tried to stiffen my jaw into resistance. But the phrase landed not as a cage, but as a promise, a possessive claim that meant he wouldn't let others take me apart. That possessiveness both frightened and thrilled me in ways I didn't understand. There were quiet vulnerabilities in Dominic that came out in scarce moments. Once, late at night, I found him in the library, fingers worried over an old photograph of a young man and a woman. For a brief minute, he looked like he'd been touched by memory. He told me then, in a voice that rarely showed cracks, about a brother who had been careless and who had paid for it with a life. The story explained nothing and everything about the man who had arrived at my door. After that, I could read the danger in him as a kind of armor more than a weapon. He wore his ruthlessness the way some people wear coats, to keep the rest of the world at a distance. Our proximity forced conversation and fragile confessions. He asked me about the hospital in small, practical doses, like he was cataloging for future reference. I told him about nights of holding hands and whispers with dying patients, about the way grief had taught me to be patient with people, about my mother and the way she hummed when she slept. He listened like examinations have a purpose, and then he offered solutions. At first, those solutions were practical and soft. A doctor who was discreet about appointments, a business manager to help me navigate benefits. But the world that cared for me also had edges. The men who had made me uncomfortable in the past were quietly steered away. Their threats dissolved like sugar in tea. For every small miracle, there was a cost I could taste like pennies. He expected obedience in exchange for safety. He expected my presence in his world to be grateful and flexible, and that I would accept the rules. Sometimes the rules felt like hugs made of ice, constricting, cold, inevitable. There were moments of tenderness. He would bring me coffee the way he thought a civilized man should, black, strong, the cup warm in his large hands. He had a habit, a small one, of studying my hands. Once he took them in his and said, "You've learned how to hold people without breaking them." I could feel nothing but honesty in his gaze. It was the first time in a long time someone had seen the invisible labor I performed. Yet even those small acts came with a power and balance I couldn't ignore. He was a man used to giving orders, and I was a woman who had always followed a different kind of command, the one that told her to heal, to soothe, to be small so others could be whole. He started to involve me in his world in ways that seemed benign at first. He asked me to accompany him to charity events, to sit at his table and look like someone who belonged. He introduced me as someone who had a job in healthcare, and the hush that followed his introduction was different from the hush of a courtroom or a morgue. It was the hush of a room that expected a story to be narrated later for curiosity's sake. The gilded cage reasserted itself, but inside it were real cushions. I learned the language of suits and discreet donations. The city began to look different from the vantage point of his world. Less hungry, more dangerous because all desire had price tags. Yet danger was sometimes flattering, like a shadow that followed you and made you feel important. I was learning that men like Dominic didn't simply protect, they claimed. And I had to decide whether the price for protection, the surrender of a life to the code of a man who traded in blood and favor, was something I could live with. In the quiet moments between his decrees, my heart started to respond in a way that made no logical sense. When he touched my shoulder lightly to guide me through a crowded room, something inside me shifted like a stone settling in a stream. When he spoke my name with an odd gentleness, like it was a pet name he scarcely allowed himself, my breath shortened. What worried me more than the thrill was how willingly I began to lean into him. I told myself I was shoring up my defenses, learning to read this man as a necessary instrument in my survival. But the truth was his protection felt like a new kind of oxygen, and with every problem he solved, the scaffolding he built for me became a home I hadn't expected to keep. The escalation came like a storm. It started with a letter that found its way into my dresser drawer, and signed and full of implication. The words were few. "You took something that isn't yours." As if someone had tried to press a hot coin into my skin, the message left a welt of fear. I thought at first this was someone Dominic had missed. Then it continued, with warnings that threaded like barbed wire. "We'll find you. You can't hide." Dominic read the messages with a face like stone. He didn't speak for a long time. Instead, he gathered his men, and they moved with a quiet efficiency that made me both safer and smaller, like an animal in a holding pattern. He told me, resolutely, that this would be taken care of, and I believed him. But belief, as I had learned, doesn't make danger evaporate into thin air. The men who had once haunted my periphery began to make themselves present, not in the house, but at the edges. A caller who knew my work schedule, a shadow at a market stand. My mother, at one point, received a visit from a man who left a single red rose and said, cryptically, "We speak soon." The pattern was clear. Whatever had found us had roots in my past. Dominic's response was a thing of terrible artistry. He took the pieces of the thread and cut them apart. He sent men to do things that were precise and final. Letters traced to an origination point. A loan shark moved out of the neighborhood with a note that told the rest of his kind what would happen if they stepped on Dominic's property. For every small victory, there was a cost that smelled faintly of blood. I stood beside him as the threats were neutralized and felt nothing but an icy, terrifying gratitude. He took the final step himself, a move that left the city's underbelly whispering for a week. He didn't boast about it. He walked back into the house like a man who'd closed a book. When he told me what he'd done, it was in the most unremarkable of tones. "It is finished," he said. There was no celebration in his voice, no triumph. Only a satisfaction like one finds after a good day's work. But for me, the aftermath was an emotional earthquake. The world that had been a montage of fear and sleeplessness was cleared. The men who had tried to follow me disappeared, like shadows swept by a keen wind. There were consequences, of course. Dominic's world had been exposed to real danger by virtue of my existence. I watched him, night after night, staying awake in the library and tending to a psychological wound that refused to close. He had a ravenous focus on protecting what was his now. And while that meant my safety, it also meant I was embedded in a system that could not tolerate weakness. One night, after the house had quieted and the staff had withdrawn to their stations, he came to my room and simply stood. "You understand now," he said softly, "that my way is harsh." I had to choose my response carefully. I could tell him I would leave, that I could live in the small corners of my home and not be a burden. But I had seen how the world watched me when Dominic had erased the problem. People in the hospital looked at me differently now. There was relief and fear in their eyes. I realized with an odd clarity that safety had become a kind of bargain I couldn't easily uncouple from. "Yes," I said finally. "I understand." He sat on the edge of the bed, and for the first time that night, his defenses lowered enough that I could see him. Not the boss, not the man of legend, but a person who was exhausted beneath everything else. He reached out and tucked my hair behind my ear, an intimate gesture that was not his language but felt like the grammar of a life I could not yet speak. The intensity between us built a slow, incandescent thing. In a house full of men who moved like statues and women who kept their own counsel, intimacy felt illicit and true. We spoke little, but our silences were elastic. They stretched to hold confessions too big for words. He taught me, in small ways, how to live inside his orbit, how to navigate the rooms, how to assess the dangers, how to hold my head without flinching when a man of consequence entered. He also taught me that he was not unbreakable. One night, when an old wound returned to pain, his hand slammed onto a table in a way that made the dishes shiver. He walked to the window and remained there with his back to me, breathing long and hard. When he turned, he was a man remade of regret. "There are things I will not forgive," he said, "and there are things I cannot change." The admission hollowed me in a way that felt like sharing both grief and intimacy. He had been forged in the hard fires of loyalty and loss, and while I could see the shield of ruthlessness, I could also see the seam where it met something tender. The more the world morphed, the more I realized that the line between being protected and being possessed was a narrow, dangerous margin. I loved the safety, the colossal relief that someone else's power could unmake the problems I lived with. But I also feared the way his protection made me feel indebted, watched, and altered. As weeks turned into months, we carve a life out of the space between danger and devotion. He taught me the curt, formal sorts of things, how to address him in public, and how not to panic when a gun appeared in the scene. I taught him to be softer when the world allowed it, to take holidays seriously, to visit my mother's small flat under the pretense of giving medicine and tea, to let the human parts of him breathe. Among the staff, conversation about us was rare and coded. Elena would sometimes catch my hands and offer a kind smile across the linen closet. "He will keep you safe," she would say in a tone that was both warning and reassurance. Marco would watch us with the look of a man watching a fire, both fascinated and afraid. In the quiet intimacy of midnight conversations, Dominic told me things he rarely let anyone know, about a childhood that had been brutal, about a father who taught him devotion like weapons are taught, about a brother who had trusted the wrong people and had been left with nothing but memory. These confessions built a map inside me, a topography of a man whose heart had been honed on loss and sharpened into pledge. I responded not by falling at his feet, but by steadiness. I became his anchor and his mirror, the person in whose presence he could be human without penalty. In time, something else happened. I stopped feeling like an accident. The wrong number that had been a mistake became a chosen position, a place I leaned into rather than escaping. And in the space where he kept me, where fences had been put up, there was a strange, earnest tenderness that dazzled and terrified. The threat that came after should have been the end of everything. It arrived in a way that suggested premeditation and an appetite for spectacle. One of Dominic's old rivals, a man with a hunger for control and a grudge against anyone who stepped on his territory, decided it was time to send a message. He targeted things I loved: an anonymous bomb threat at the hospital where I worked, an arson attempt at my mother's building, and a smear campaign that tried to make my face synonymous with scandal. They attacked the public spaces of my life, where I had once thought I was invulnerable because the world knew me as a nurse, not as someone attached to the dangerous man who protected me. Dominic's reaction was measured and devastating. He gathered his lieutenants, and they moved like a storm. He offered me two choices: stay and be shielded, stay and be honored for the sacrifice, or leave and learn to live with the kind of fear he had never afforded to his enemies. I refused to be the cause of more violence if I could avoid it. "I'll stand with you," I told him, choosing, not from bravery, but from the sense that I had nowhere else to go. He did not desire my sacrifice. He desired my presence. That difference mattered. The final confrontation was not cinematic in the way movies make it. It was calculated and messy, with men moving through cold streets and secrets traded like currency. There were nights of sleepless watches and a crescendo of danger that made my stomach tighten and my hands tremble. Dominic was different in that fight, a man reduced to pure, lethal competence. He was both tender and terrible, and the two traits made each other more volatile. When it ended, the rival was broken in ways that couldn't be undone easily. Dominic had not only defended his territory, he'd carved it deeper into the city's veins so his enemies would know to fear the cost of Thaujon. The aftermath left us both exhausted and raw. There was a period of quiet where the world seemed to hold its breath. We didn't talk much. We simply existed in a shared silence thick enough to be tangible. He would leave in the mornings and return at odd hours, his suits dusted with city grime and his eyes hollow with the things he had to do. I would place my hands on his shoulders and feel his weight, both physical and the weight of expectation. There's a strange intimacy born of survival. When you share a life-threatening event with someone, it's like being stitched into their skin. In the weeks that followed, Dominic did something that altered the texture of our relationship. He took me to a small, private chapel in the hills, a place away from the city that smelled of pine and quiet. He did not make a show of it. There were no cameras, no announcements. He stood in the doorway like a man who had rehearsed a life and was now choosing to live part of it differently. He told me, in a voice that did not contain the economy of command, that he wanted me in his life not as someone he protected, but as someone he loved. The word hung between us like a fragile glass ornament. I wanted to demolish it with logic. This was a man who made his love a possession and whose devotion could be as deadly as a folded blade. But his hands were open in a way that felt like an offering, and in the quiet hush of the chapel, I heard sincerity. He said he wanted to protect me, to build a future where my mother would have peace and where his rage would be tempered by the life we could have together. I thought of my mother, of her face softened by sleep and medication, of the small life I'd left behind for safety, and I realized that I had grown into something else. I had become a woman who had survived by leaning into dangerous shelter and now had to decide whether to remain under that shelter because it was safe or because it was home. Loving Dominic meant accepting a world that had rules I might never fully understand. It meant living under the shadow of men who had blood on their hands. It meant being both honored and potentially used. And yet, beneath all these concessions, there was a thread of something tender and honest that made me want to say yes. He didn't demand immediacy. Instead, he asked for a step, for a choice that would bind us together. He offered me his name, his life, and the promise that he would change what he could for us to be possible. I thought about what I had been before Dominic, someone who measured survival by shifts and bus schedules, who loved in ways that cost little and asked for less. I thought about who I had become, a woman who had found agency not by escaping danger, but by aligning herself with power that could be wielded for good. The decision felt monumental and small at once. I took his hand and felt the calluses and the steady pulse that had been honed by violence and devotion. I felt the weight of being chosen by someone who could command legions, yet chose to protect me. And in that choice, I found my answer, not a surrender, but a recalibration. I accepted him not because I feared the world without him, but because I believed he could be molded by love into something less terrible. When he asked me outright, in the hush of the chapel where our breaths came out like fog, I chose to stay. The word wife wasn't spoken that day, but the promise was present in how he looked at me, like a man who would keep vigil over a life in exchange for its warmth. Living with Dominic afterward was a negotiation of power and tenderness. He had not shed his ruthlessness. He had refined it. We built rituals that allowed softness in the margins, Sunday mornings that belonged only to us, walks in private gardens where the city shrank to a hum, small dinners where we practiced casual speech like a foreign language. He was jealous in ways that made my skin prickle, but his jealousy always came with an undertone of protection. When he called me my Claire, it felt less like possession and more like the naming of a partner who altered the orbit of his existence. The staff adapted. Elena became a friend in a quiet way, a confidant who had watched me move from frightened to deliberate. Marco would crack a smile when he saw us together. Dominic's men learned to offer me respect with the same kind of ritual they offered everything else in the house. There were moments, tender and sharp, where we found an equilibrium. We argued, sometimes about the smallness of my daily worries, and other times about the enormity of the world he navigated. He listened with a focus that made even the hardest words seem possible. He taught me how to assert myself not by defiance, but by reason, by the simple force of my presence. Eventually, the world that had once threatened us learned to leave us alone. Dominic's influence spread in ways both elegant and crude, like a garden growing over jagged rock. When my mother came to live with us, a quiet woman with a habit for humming while she slept, the house took on a new rhythm. The daily life of cooking, cleaning, and watching soap operas became a quiet rebellion against the violence that had once defined us. I began to see Dominic in the morning light in a way I hadn't when he'd been only a legend. He was a man who read the paper slowly, who made small jokes that never left his mouth fully formed, who brushed his teeth in the same careful way every night. The rough edges of him softened in spaces where no one watched. I, in turn, felt my past anchors loosen. The fear that had kept me up at night unspooled into patience and purpose. I learned that to be loved by a man like Dominic was to be visible in a way that demanded courage. He taught me to be brave in new ways, to be in a room full of his world and not flinch, to speak up when something wasn't right, to accept the mantle of responsibility that came with being attached to power. Our love, if it could be called that, was not a gentle, airy thing. It was forged in necessity and sharpened by danger, and its heat was the kind that purifies by fire. We were both altered by it, better and worse, complicated and complete. In the end, everything that had seemed like a wrong turn, the phone call, the envelope, the men who had once haunted my cheap apartment, became the artery through which I was given a life I'd barely imagined. Dominic, the man who announced himself with a sentence that had felt like a sentence of doom, had become my protector, my partner, and the most complicated part of my salvation. The world would tell different versions of our story in whispers, that I was bought, that I was taken, that I had no agency. None of those voices heard the truth of the slow change that took place. The small decisions, the tiny acts of kindness, the moments when two damaged people bridged the gap between safety and love. We had been accidental players in a drama neither of us wrote entirely, but we chose to stay in the scene anyway. Months turned into years, and the edges of that first terror smoothed. I still woke sometimes with my heart pounding, but more often I woke with the steady warmth of a life that had a rhythm. Morning coffee, walks down a private lane, phone calls with my mother, evenings in a city that no longer felt at war with me. Dominic and I had woven a life that balanced his power with my own stubborn need for agency. He didn't ask me to abandon who I was. Instead, he encouraged me to bring my humanity into his world. He funded a clinic in a neighborhood that needed it, and I helped run it, guiding nurses and talking to patients with that old, steady competence that had once been my lifeline. We were no longer the figures in the early days, a frightened woman and a man who tracked danger like weather. We had become partners in a strange, powerful way, a union that made the city bend to their will in silence. There were things in Dominic I could never fully change, the exacting code, the occasional unspoken violence necessary for maintaining order. But he learned that cruelty could be replaced sometimes by strategic mercy. He learned that his world could be softer without losing its teeth. And I learned that love, when given to the wrong person, can be a ruin. When given to the right one, can be redemption. Reflection often turned my mind back to that first call, to the wrong number that said, "Don't hang up. I'm coming for you." It felt like a thread stitched from fate itself. I had been a person adrift in a small life when a voice dropped from the sky and altered everything. What once seemed like a terrible mistake had become my salvation. I had been plucked from the edge and placed in the center of an existence built of marble, loyalty, and a dangerously beautiful man who had taught me how to love and be loved in a language I had never been given. There were compromises. There were nights when I argued with him about the morality of his methods. There were times I lay awake and wondered if the darkness he navigated would one day swallow everything we'd built. But the answer to the question of whether I had been saved or trapped finally landed in a way I couldn't deny. I had a choice, and I had chosen him with my eyes open. We had made a new life on the ruins of old mistakes. In the end, Dominic knelt one evening beneath a sky full of indifferent stars and asked me to be his in a way that sounded like permanence. The weight of the world fell away then. There was no more pretense. I said yes because I had learned to trust the man who had once told me not to hang up. We vowed to use the power between us not simply for dominance, but to protect, to heal, and to hold the fragile things the world ignored. We were not saints. We were people who had found each other in a storm and decided to remain. The house that had once been so foreign now smelled like bread and laundry and familiar perfumes. Dominic's hands fit around mine the way the world finally felt right. He still kept his codes and his iron. He still moved through rooms like someone who could command the air itself. But beneath it all, he had learned to make room for tenderness. I kept my nurse's steady hands and my small acts of care and used them in a house that had once seemed designed only for power. My mother lived with us, humming on her best days and stubborn on her worst. Elena, Marco, and the others remained, their loyalty a tapestry that bound us in ways more complicated than allegiance. The wrong number had been a mistake that became the axis of my life. It had been a sentence that had led to a sentence, one marked by danger, love, and the most improbable kind of salvation. We learned together how to be whole as a unit, imperfect and fierce. There would be more storms in the future, I'm sure. There are always storms for those who live on the edges of what's acceptable. But standing beside Dominic, with a life that had been remade by fierce hands and softer ones, I felt prepared to face whatever could come. The night he first said, out of habit and claim, "You're mine," I didn't flinch. I reached for his hand and said, "And you're mine." We had both been saved, or at least we had both been remade by a wrong number and a choice to hold on. If you like this story, like and subscribe for more stories like this, and let me know in the comments what you'd like to hear next.